runaway slaves had night visions. That Henrietta Lacks had super soldier serum in her cells.
Wakanda kind of wealth.
Vibranium smiles.
Underground railroad stealth.
Ralph wrote An Invisible Man, but we drip in hues of midnight melanin.
We rooted dirt deep. These kinks connect us. 360 Afro.
Black girl magic is not clever wording. Sisters with locks are supernatural. Black is cyclical. At ends we begin. Bend time like wormhole slit. My spit is intergalactic. We Ra, sun god, not son of God. We don't walk on water, we sun jog. Watch this sun, moonwalking on Milky Ways and eclipse. Now all they see is blackness.
The world is our atlas. Don't shrug. Ancestral shoulders hold us up. Dialing in to connect with Egyptian kin.
Pick up, phoning home to Horus and Isis. We extraterrestrial, bicycling on pyramid-shaped pedals, traveling back to ancient to shape-shift the ghetto.
Black inks turn armored tanks, the revenge of the lynchings.
Cyborgs clenching fists and taking back communities. Battle suits made of all the weapons used in Nat Turner's rebellion. Answering every villain with Biggie quotes. Untouchable.
Uncrushable.
This is the reboot, or we reconstruct reconstruction.
Where Jim Crow gets sent a falcon.
I live this Afrofuturism. My heritage is not a fantasy, but there is something so beautiful about my skin. It seems sci-fi, how we form an injustice league.
Levitation on the b-ball court. Tongue out, no wings, just a black boy thing.
And these hips magnetic, summoning spirits like Vixen when the music gets rhythmic. Being a mutant ain't nothing but your DNA having a revolution. This is funkadelic legislation. Parliament-style government, board the mothership, and marvel at this greatness. All right, so last episode, we talked in depth about the downfalls of gentrification. But more importantly, we spoke about the ways that artists have been the purveyors of gentrification, those that feed into an education industrial complex, who seek degrees in order to break into the industry. But the mediocre education that they receive makes them less than competitive, so they move to urban city centers, into blighted, underserved communities, to be industry adjacent and continue to pursue education while working in an unrelated field, thus DIY gentrifying the new neighborhood they call home. We also spoke about the fact that even our best attempts to imagine a Black utopia have been whitewashed, that we have been taught to desire the bright and shiny countries that survive by sucking the life force out of some Black or brown working class. And this desire for a new day Roman Empire leads us to forget the socio-cultural technology that makes Black folks uniquely powerful and moreover can lead us to endorsing the Malthusian notions of population control via mass incarceration, sterilization, and displacement. But we didn't just want to leave you with an earful of complaints. In this episode, we want to discuss some of the solutions, discuss how we can envision a healthy, vibrant, and positive future for Black communities through a liberatory lens while decoupling ourselves from a Eurocentric framework. So let's begin, shall we?
Okay, let's go.
In Baltimore, there is a main thoroughfare called Pennsylvania Avenue.
And for folks out there in listener land, Pennsylvania Avenue is the main corridor on the west side of Baltimore. It flows diagonally from around the middle of the city down all the way to the center of the city where there is a body of water, what we call the Inner Harbor. And for decades in the 20th century, this was a large, thriving Black community, Black middle-class community. The classic example is this is where the families who own their homes wash their marble steps every week to make them shiny and as a symbol of the pride they have in their home ownership.
The Baltimore nightclub scene, it was very, very active until I think a little bit after the riots, the clubs started getting smaller, there were less places to work. But from my point of view, it's always been always had great musicians in Baltimore.
When I turned 18, somebody told me about a gig on Pennsylvania Avenue. Somebody needed a drummer on Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, I wasn't allowed on Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue was where all the musicians played.
Oh, Pennsylvania Avenue was a mecca. I mean, you could just step outside the door and your choice of restaurants to eat in, you just smell the air and you pick one.
Everybody that lived off of Pennsylvania Avenue went to Pennsylvania Avenue. And you got to remember, and this was during a time when there was a lot of segregation. Black people didn't go downtown to enjoy themselves. They weren't wanted. So they made their own little community where all the musicians would come and play. It was called the Chitlin Circuit. The Royal Theater, the Apollo Theater in New York. This is where most of the black people would go. And a lot of the white musicians would come in and play. Because the black musicians couldn't go to the white venues, but the white musicians could come to the black venues.
You would go down Pennsylvania Avenue, and this is the way you would go all night long, crossing the street to go to one bar to another, and most of them had music. And the food was wonderful, Baltimore's a crab cake town and seafood town.
As you've heard, Pennsylvania Avenue had a thriving arts and entertainment apparatus in Baltimore prior to the 1980s. But due to the riots of '68 and major disinvestment in black communities, the prominence of Pennsylvania Avenue has since faded away. Over the past few decades, many have worked to figure out how to revive Pennsylvania Avenue. The newest attempt is the designation of Pennsylvania Avenue thoroughfare as an arts district. The benefits of such a designation include the prioritization of placemaking, enhanced property values, and tax credits like the property tax credit, income tax subtraction modifications, and exemptions from the admission and amusement tax.
Now, I know some of you are wondering how this is not exactly like the creative class, the theory espoused by scholar Richard Florida, which led to a fast track towards gentrification that we spoke about in the last episode, right, Brion?
Right. But for starters, as I said in the previous episode, when there's an intentional focus on the indigenous population and culture of a community, that can be the first step to redevelopment that does not lead to gentrification. And as we previously heard, Pennsylvania Avenue was the black mecca of art and entertainment, and thus, this redevelopment model aligns with the community's organic makeup. But there are additional opportunities here for community-centric solutions. So let me ask you a question, Lawrence. If you are a traditional economist, what do you look for in terms of economic impact?
I imagine they might look for the amount of economic activity in an area, especially the new dollars, like new money being pumped into an area.
Right, and that's very true. I would say traditional economists track new dollars, as you put it, in four primary ways. They look at tax revenue, business profits, jobs and wages, and the money generated through tourism. The problem here is that the emphasis on value is placed on how much can be extracted out of a community. It's like a siphoning model. As long as a community thrives, the local government benefits from, say, tax revenue. It also attracts large corporations like Walmart, Target, and etc., and provides jobs within the local economy. But the trade-off is with smaller local businesses who have to downsize or even fold, leading to the subsequent loss of wages and jobs in the same neighborhoods. Additionally, less than 20% of the revenue from large chain stores actually stays in the local community, and the rest, again, is siphoned out. And then there's this serious focus on tourism. How many new people can we get to spend new money that was not already being generated in a particular area? So much so that if a business district is not generating considerable tourist dollars, it is seen as non-viable.
So cities are justifying these investments with projections, these multi-million-dollar projections of quote-unquote economic activity. And in that term that sounds neutral, the money that other people spend counts. But you're saying it discounts the money the community itself could also produce. This feels like some kind of trickle-down economics.
Right. Exactly. But I think that there is an alternative to this siphoning economic model. It may be less attractive to traditional economists, but will be more effective for historically disenfranchised communities. This model is more like a funnel. When you look at a funnel, it's wide at the top and narrows at the bottom to guide the liquid poured into it in a concerted way. What this looks like is money and resources poured into a community like, say, the Black Arts District along the Pennsylvania Avenue thoroughfare in order to redevelop it, but using a different lens to analyze its viability. There are millions of dollars in tax credits available for development, but these dollars are often earmarked for large-scale business conglomerates, chain stores, and upscale luxury homes and apartments. The funnel model would take the same kind of funding and earmark it for development of small business within a local economy, which will be far more impactful. To take it a step further, imagine that the original funnel is attached to a hydro turbine, which spins the water like a propeller, and the energy generated by that turbine is then used to create a more sustainable model.
Wait. Are we talking about the Hoover Dam? Like, how does a hydropower engine relate to Black economic development?
Right. Okay, just stick with me. I know it's metaphorical. I'm a poet. Let's just keep going. Let's use the Black Arts District as the model. So, we have Artist A, who was paid to do a workshop for a group of middle school students. Then, Artist A has a meeting with Artist B at a local cafe, say, talking about graphic design for an upcoming event. The cafe uses fresh produce grown in the district's urban garden and sells artisan crafts also created in the district. After local artists A and B decide on an upcoming project where artist B will create a flyer for artist A connects with a printing company also within the district to get those flyers printed. And that upcoming event will be held in a venue housed in the district and run by other Black artists. I could continue this scenario for several more minutes, but I'll stop there. Let's go back to the initial transaction. Artist A was paid to do a workshop, and that revenue will circulate throughout the community several times before it ever leaves. It was invested in an arts entrepreneur, in a local cafe, in a printing company, and a local performance venue. And then each of those businesses recirculates those dollars in a similar fashion. So it's like a hydro turbine. The funnel poured the water into the turbine, and the turbine circulated that water to create a sustainable model for the community it powers. So those original dollars were poured into the funnel. The funnel then guided the money or the water to the arts district in a specific community-centric way. The water was then circulated through an economic turbine that then serves as an economic engine to sustain and repower itself. This model doesn't wholly rely on new tourist dollars or large-scale corporations from outside the community, and instead intentionally pours into the community, providing an opportunity for self-determination and empowerment. This has the potential to produce healthier Black communities. Additionally, the Black Arts District can also be used to implement other safeguards that protect the community from the onslaught of gentrification. One example, building on our social and cultural technology, is a bartering network.
In Search of Black Power is made possible by community sustainers. Community sustainers are people who make a monthly investment in the work of LBS. Political advocacy and independent media require resources that come from the community to sustain itself. LBS is not housed in a foundation, nonprofit, or political party. We are a for-profit think tank funded by the people. It's important that our work remains independent so that Black folks can independently advocate for ourselves in the halls of power so we can have the keys to our future. Help us continue this work by becoming a sustainer today. Sign up at lbsbaltimore.com/sustain.
In many underserved, underprivileged communities where access to large swaths of resources and money are not available, folks use the services and the crafts of their hands as currency. And so if I am a poet and I could perform at someone's event and that person, say, owns a printing company, or they have space where I could potentially do shows, I could give my service as a poet for free to that person who then grants me space for free or prints maybe 200 flyers for me for free. And in this way, we both are able to use our resources in a more economically viable way and still get the services that we need provided for. Another example is co-ops and communal businesses. This is a concept that Jessica Gordon Neimhardt talks about extensively.
I started thinking about it because I was working actually with the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, D.C. We were trying to figure out family-friendly economic development policies, right, that satisfy all the sort of values of sharing and democracy and family supporting and all that kind of stuff. And I realized that a friend of mine had been working on Du Bois's philosophy about cooperative economics. So I kind of gave him a call, and he reminded me I could read his dissertation, and then we talked, and we decided to write an article about why cooperative economics would actually be a good economic strategy. For slavery, we're talking about informal cooperative economics, so not an official co-op business or something, but just collectively raising money to buy somebody's freedom. So people would share, like one person might buy themselves out, then they would save money to buy their mother or their daughter or their wife or their father or that kind of thing. So that level of collectivity, people even consider the Underground Railroad to be a kind of collective activity, sort of collective economics, sharing of resources, that kind of thing. But the more official kind of relationships I found were what's called mutual aid societies. Health, death, health, widows and orphans, that kind of thing. And basically it was everybody puts in a certain amount every year or every month, and then whoever needs it gets to take it out. So what do? If you're mad with somebody for registering to vote, you evict them. So they would register to vote. By the time they got back home to their farm, all their stuff is out in the street, and they don't have a farm anymore, they don't have a house. So what do? Well, if you have like Freedom Quilting Bee in Alberta, Alabama, Freedom Quilting Bee was actually women sharecroppers selling their quilts that they quilted in the winter, right? Making enough money to buy 23 acres of land to build a sewing factory so they could produce even more quilts. Well, once their families get evicted, where do they go? They go to the 23 acres of land that the co-op owns and start to reestablish them until they actually can even maybe buy their own plot of land or get another place to farm or that kind of thing.
Oftentimes, in Black communities, we talk about our lack of trust or our lack of cooperation. But as you've heard in the previous clip, we have a long, extensive history with cooperatives. And I think that this model in spaces designed for cooperatives and communal businesses to thrive could be transformative in building healthy communities. I think the last thing that I want to note is our ability to sort of repurpose some traditionally racist practices that have been used to disenfranchise and oppress communities of color. Take, for example, covenants. A covenant is a legally enforceable contract imposed in a deed upon the buyer of a property. In the previous episode, we talked about redlining and the way covenants were used to keep Black folks out of the housing market and out of certain communities. Owners who violate the terms of a covenant risk forfeiting the very property that they own. Most covenants run with the land and are legally enforceable on future buyers of the property. So these racially restrictive covenants refer to contractual agreements that prohibit the purchase, lease, or occupation of a piece of property by a particular group of people. And again, these were usually African Americans. Racially restrictive covenants were not only mutual agreements between property owners and neighborhoods not to sell to certain people, but were also agreements enforced through the cooperation of real estate boards and neighborhood associations, right? These things started to pop up around the late 1920s. And I posit that today, Black folks could repurpose this idea of covenants to ensure that businesses in a particular community remain Black-owned or remain within a cooperative structure, right? And so we can take this idea of covenants, which were used to keep us out, repurpose them, and use them as a means to keep us in, keep us connected, keep our businesses black, and keep our businesses in a cooperative structure, so that even if in years down the road, different people come in and run, say, the Black Art District, the businesses would need to remain the way that they were originally built in order to keep that community viable. Another example are community benefits agreements, or CBAs, which are contracts signed by community groups and real estate developers that require the developer to provide specific amenities or mitigations to the local community or neighborhood. Some are even site-specific, which ensure that particular projects create opportunities for local workers and community members. This approach, I believe, can change the city's development paradigm, especially when decision makers realize that community-driven projects with specific benefits can transform communities and begin to lift them out of a poverty state while not gentrifying the neighborhood in the process. And so we often talk about, what does anti-gentrification work look like? And I feel like if developers and community groups were at the same table creating the terms by which communities would be developed, that in its very nature inherently means that that neighborhood will not be gentrified. And it's contractual, right? It's not theoretical. It's something that is hard and on paper. And these community benefits also means that the community will be working to make sure that folks who live and play in that community also have a stake in the community's viability. The last thing that I want to talk about is community land trust. Again, this is another form or mechanism to make sure that the community controls what is happening and being produced and developed in that community. It's a nonprofit corporation that develops and stewards affordable housing, community gardens, maybe civic buildings, commercial spaces, and etc. on behalf of the community. So if we take the Black Arts District as an example, the Arts District itself could have community lands trust over certain buildings and gardens and other spaces within the Black Arts District. And this would create an opportunity for, despite buildings passing hands, folks dying, and, say a club owner passes away and hasn't written in who that club would then be passed down to, if the land and the space itself is owned largely by the district, then it can then repurpose or resell that space back into the district to a new owner, and to make sure, again, that there is always a mechanism for success of the district despite the inevitable turnover of leadership. So I feel like urban land trusts, community benefits agreements, covenants, and the like, cooperatives, and bartering networks are all very non-traditional and even radical ways of ensuring that the communities that we are imagining and building for ourselves will actually be viable beyond the imaginative state. So I know it sounds cliche, but my answer to gentrification lives within us. We have everything we need. We are already enough. White supremacy renders Black communities invisible. It doesn't recognize our cultural production as valuable. It sees us as fungible and our communities as non-viable. But a Black Arts District designed to sustain itself, built organically and on its own terms, is a direct response to those fallible assumptions.
So, Brion, your comments relate to some of the things we talked about last episode. Arts can be a driver for gentrification, but if you change the way you look at it, it can be a driver for Black self-determination. And in a similar vein, I want to talk about some of the things I talked about last episode, where we mentioned how some visions for the future of cities that are supposed to be Black and supposed to be good for Black people actually reflect some flawed assumptions. And the analogy I used last time, and I want to build upon it this time, is while you were talking almost about like a water cycle, about funnels and turbines, I want to talk about ecosystems. And how do we go from a food chain where different individuals are competing and eating each other in this competitive framework? If we step out, we have a larger vision of a food web, how everything is interconnected. And can we see different ways that a Black future can build via an ecosystem model that's symbiotic, where people are helping each other and have a vision for a radical Black future. So I'm very glad you mentioned Jessica Gordon Neimhardt, because that was actually part of a multi-month project with different people throughout Baltimore, where we used, among other people, the work of Jessica Gordon Neimhardt to have in-depth conversations about what some of these future symbiotic Black institutions might look like. And here's some of the stuff we came up with. So before I get to the examples of the future institutions, I want to, like you, briefly recap some of the things that I talked about last time. Because when we were talking about ecosystems, last time we were talking about this idea of parasites, how these visions of the future, these new economic institutions are actually sucking some of the lifeblood out of Black Baltimore. And while we were using the example of African nations and colonialism, we also talked about how you can see this very dynamic happening within cities, within Black neighborhoods, in cities where new developments pop up and begin to suck the life force out of the existing Black neighborhoods. And this is exactly the conversation we had in our research group. And so if it's just a little project, of course you can do Amazon and some little project. If it's a pilot, of course you can do Amazon and a pilot. You can even do Amazon and a credit union, right? But if you need to have something that frames the trade-offs, the structural, political, social inertia that goes with an Amazon and Under Armour, and why we should want to move in a different direction. And so that's a fundamental argument that you have to make to folks about you need to make a choice about the future you want to have. And so we have to show them that future so they even know there is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really looking for a predatory alternative that eats the other choice.
Economic development doesn't happen in isolation. So new economic developments can be like parasites. They can be like invasive species, sucking up the existing resources in order to replicate itself. The example we gave last time was a transportation network. And this is actually a prime example we talked about in our group about how you need to have competing visions. And if you build a transportation network that, in a seemingly altruistic sense, connects Black folks to the jobs, what you're actually doing is building an infrastructure to hollow out Black neighborhoods. Yeah, I mean, think about the transportation infrastructure. When you have a colony, you build the railroads to flow to the ports so you can get all that goodness out of the country. When you have a nation, you build the transportation infrastructure to circulate people around the nation, right? You can't build railroads. If you have to build a railroad, you can't build it both to the ocean to extract the natural resources and to the urban centers, connecting the urban centers to refine in country and ship within country. Like, you literally can't do both. And it's a similar thing with Baltimore. We have a bus system. You cannot design a bus system to bus people out of the city and into the county where the jobs are, while simultaneously designing a bus system designed to bus people around the hubs of Black economic development. Right? Like, you literally can't do both. You literally can't build a light rail to Port Covington, and, you know, if you wanted to, we could debate about this. So we literally can't be neutral on a moving train. If we go back to the ecosystem analogy, you are sucking the nutrients out of the ecosystem and preventing them from recirculating, like you talked about, Brion. So what we talked about, again, with an ecosystem theory, is you can't just present a vision for a Black future. You have to present a vision for a Black future that's competitive with the white futures people have planned for Black Baltimore, for Black cities. You need what we called a predatory vision of the future.
A predatory vision of the future. I'm not sure that I can quite imagine what that looks like.
Yeah, so again, we're in an ecosystem here. And when we say predatory, we don't mean like predatory loans. We mean one that is competitive with not just the existing systems, but the existing systems of thought and the existing propaganda around Black folks. When I thought about this episode, I thought about a few acronyms. The first was TINA, TINA. There is no alternative. This is the phrase famously attached to former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And what she was talking about was neoliberalism, capitalist economies in the face of the Soviet Union. There was simply no viable alternative to her vision of slashing public benefits, deregulation, and her vision of what the future can be. And this is exactly what people are saying now. And it's not just a fear of losing money. It's become psychological colonization. We can't think beyond the limits of our capitalist futures. Another example of an acronym, and this is from a quote from Mark Twain, TEM. Mark Twain famously said he thought socialism never truly caught on in America because no one in America considers themselves poor. They consider themselves temporarily embarrassed millionaires. So this logic of economic growth above everything else means that you can't even question anything that claims to be good for economic growth because you're saying that black folks can't win. You're saying we can't have good futures. But if you change the view just a little bit and you see that these visions of the future help destroy black communities, then really we have no alternative but to create radically different black futures that directly compete with the systems of thought, with the visions that are being presented to us. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we create a predatory vision that is predatory upon the subconscious belief in black inferiority that is driving so much of our conversation today?
So for me, I understand what you're saying and I agree, because we can't just talk about a future, but we must talk about a future that actually competes and beats out the other futures that are being sold to us right now.
Exactly. Because if we don't do that, what we get is kind of a tokenism. We say, oh, that's cute. We can do that too. But I'm still going to build Port Covington. I'm still going to gentrify your neighborhood and build a land trust. Gentrification and some new covenants in some places. So we have to truly explain to people why these two worlds cannot exist. And when they have to pick a black future that is truly predatory upon the white futures being sold to us. So what do some of these things look like? I'm going to start with the basis of our food web, the grass on the savanna that feeds everything else in the food web. In this case, I think that might be money flowing into the communities, credit. It's the life force that helps build up these communities. So right now, we have banks, we even have credit unions, but we often find it's hard for people to get access to the current credit unions that exist. Because, in the heyday of black banks, you couldn't go to Bank of America, you couldn't go to Wells Fargo. Now our folks can. So something in our vision has to be a driver for desiring a behavior change, as opposed to just Killer Mike tweeting out, I'm putting my money in a black bank.
I see that on Facebook. I think it's behavior too, because it's like what the people want. The only problem is that when you go to the MeQs or whatever, is it I can't get my money until a week later, or is it really, because I can go to Wells Fargo or something and be like, I want 75%, because Bank of America, you pretty much get your whole check, especially if it's a Bank of America check. You get your money right there. So I don't know.
Well, in theory, the credit union is investing in the community. Mm-hmm. It's making the types of loans that other institutions don't make. Is that happening now? If that is happening now, why don't more people seem to know about it? And if we do need an alternative institution, what could it do to be able to show folks the economic value it produces? So here I want you to imagine something different. I want you to imagine a more nimble, community-focused credit union that looks at the black community as it is right now and creates solutions and possibilities that are off the map for our current financial institutions. So I have a bunch of money in my savings account because I like saving money. I don't have a ton of access to credit. That to me doesn't make sense. Let's say I want it. It's just something happened and I didn't want to tap into my savings account. And I just needed a couple $100 in credit. If I have a couple $1,000 in the savings account, could it be possible for that to kind of impact the ability to just have a small amount of credit from a financial institution? Historically, financial institutions have more leniency to figure out how they engage credit. It's just conceptually. So it's how, if we have a mechanism like a savings lottery, incentivizing people to save more money, let's say they're successful. And then, as opposed to traditional notions of credit, we can have non-traditional notions of credit, which include like specifically how much you have in your savings account right now. And I'll just give you a couple hundred, 10% of your savings account in credit. Like, that will just be something that the credit union could offer that Wells Fargo just ain't gonna offer. Right, using the savings account as straight up collateral for a credit. And then you can get into all the other things you could do in terms of alternative notions of creditworthiness. Some of them interesting, some of them terrifying.
Just identifying the permutations of groundings for credit decisions. Mm-hmm. You've expanded the options available for credit far beyond anything Wells Fargo would consider.
So what types of things might this credit union do? When we say prize-backed savings accounts, we're really talking about the policy racket, the numbers game, this indigenous cultural solution in the black community that produced black millionaires like Little Willie Adams in Baltimore, who used his money from running numbers to invest in political infrastructure throughout the city. We're talking about every time you put money in your savings account, imagine you basically get a lottery ticket. And instead of putting your money into the corner store, the people who play the lottery put their money into the savings account. And every week or every month or so, somebody wins. They can get their money and put their winnings on Instagram. And the whole community can know that this new financial institution creates the possibility for the types of changing of your status that right now only come to somewhat predatory institutions like the state lottery.
Wow. So it's like a large-scale lending tree that would ultimately put lotteries out of business.
Exactly, but I'm not just looking at the lotteries. I'm also looking at truly predatory institutions in our communities. People talk about payday loans and the obscene amount of interest you have to pay on these short-term loans. Problem is, people need credit. So you need to have, again, a viable alternative. So what if this new financial institution didn't just look at your credit score, or even the credit score of your friends to determine whether you got a loan or not, but could see the social impact of you and your community, you and your village, as a framework for whether and how they would invest in you. And this is the types of conversations that came up when we were thinking about what these new institutions could look like in our study group.
If what you're looking at is crowdsourcing.
And instead of the creditworthiness of your social network, which some people do, the social impact of the folks in your social network, right? So I have people in my social network that have great credit scores, but a lot of folks from my neighborhood don't. But if they are friends with, PFK Boone, or they're friends with Joe Jones, or they're friends with Chango Yango, or they're friends with Michael Scott, or they're friends with all these other people who not just have a bunch of friends, but have a bunch of people who have access to social networks, it's like, okay, if that person's down bad, I bet Chango can help him out, or I bet Michael can help him out, I bet John can help them out. And it may not be because Chango has a great credit score, because Chango got like 10 kids. But because Chango got like 10 kids, Chango know everybody. Right? So we're reframing the way that we conceptualize these issues.
So social currency isn't really tangible or seemingly tradable. So I think most people would question, how can we make things like cultural capital quantifiable? Ultimately, I think it's the reason why people distrust the idea of bartering, like I talked about, and may distrust some of the things we're talking about right now.
That's a good point. And one thing you got to remember is that when we talk about some of these futures, we have to create our own, or they can create it for us in ways that don't help us. So people are already using your social network to determine your creditworthiness. But it happens in a very Eurocentric way that's very problematic. They have studies that show if you have a couple of people in your friend tree who have low credit scores, then the whole credit tree is deemed less creditworthy in the status quo. So again, if you have a culturally responsive view of how black communities work, you tilt your head, you tilt your gaze, you see something different. What if you look at the amount of connections your community has to not just nonprofits, but other community groups doing work in your community that have a positive impact? What if we look at the amount of engagement, the positive engagement that happens on different posts by people in your friend tree? What if we view the connection that you may have to other people as the starting point for different forms of financial services? You know, you talked about giving circles, the so-called SUSU model, where you're able to get access to loans if other people in your SUSU group have been able to successfully repay their loans. So you have mutual support and mutual obligation to help the people in your network be successful in whatever their venture is. Funny thing is, we've studied this in developing countries, and it's been proven that you can use social capital as a framework to build upon positive financial capital and economic growth. But because we don't see the vestiges of this cultural technologies coming from Africa to America, we haven't studied this extensively in the United States. In a majority black city like Baltimore, these microloans, building upon existing social networks, could be the starting point for new financial institutions that literally seed new social and political possibilities in Black Baltimore.
This sounds good, but we have businesses being created all the time. Even if they never formally have a tax status, people are working in Black Baltimore. So if there are green shoots of our ecosystem, how do you nourish them and then, help them grow?
That's a great question. And it raises another example where we have to change our discourse, change our view. People talk about anchor institutions. This is a phrase used constantly in economic development conversations. And think of the literal place that comes from. This is, of course, a nautical term where you anchor your ship so it doesn't get blown around by the winds or the tides. But if you shift your gaze just a little bit, you can see what we traditionally call these anchor institutions, these universities, or, like you said, the white arts districts. Don't keep the community stable, but they literally drag the community down. There's this gravity and suction that comes from them. So what if you view the community in itself as the anchor institution? What if you view this network of cultural relationships as the mechanism for financial exchange and the framework to what you do business development and economic expansion within the Black community?
Right. I think that's exactly what we're talking about with the Black Arts District.
Exactly. So that's a cooperative structure, but we need to rethink the ecosystem. And if you're talking about the why and the what, I want to have a conversation about some of the how. What is the actual infrastructure we have to build to make things like you talked about possible? How do we create a virtuous cycle for individuals? And fortunately, we already have a model that people in Baltimore have been developing over years of grassroots work that they call the promissory. I want to divide this into 3 phases. So phase 1 of the promissory is what I call the dream catcher phase. We have so many people doing economic activity in even so-called poor Black communities, but they may not know if there's someone living right next to them who could help them with their own business. So imagine you have someone who produces music living 2 doors down from someone who does graphic design. They may not even know each other is there or how to connect to each other. So in the promissory model, you give Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi, to the whole footprint. And you create a software platform, literally an app, where people can register and promote their businesses so people can know who's who and who's where. So think of it like a dating app. If you are doing a business and you see someone who's doing something that can help you, you can literally swipe right. And that can be the starting point for your connection to people in your neighborhood who can help you build your dream. Second phase of the promissory is the dream weaver phase. So we have so many people, and now we know who they are. We know who might want to connect. So they may be able to build cooperative agreements between each other. Maybe a formal co-op, maybe not. But you have a space for people to not just have an individual capitalist dream, but a communal vision for advancement where their social capital in their very community is the starting point for how they get access to resources and how they get access to business development. Which gets us to the final stage of the promissory, the dream builder phase, where you're creating a capital infusion to expand the ability for these people to do work in the footprint, the community, but also to draw in money from outside the community, to be able to have everyone in the community be able to do more business and turn, in many cases, what is a side hustle, potentially into their primary career.
So essentially, this is like a business incubation model.
You could call it that, but I see it as an ecosystem reinvigoration model. There's a story people tell about when they reintroduce wolves to the famous Yellowstone Park. Science isn't sure about it, but it's a really good story. That when you introduce these predators back into their natural habitat, it creates a virtuous cycle where you prevent the prey animals from overgrazing. And by keeping everything moving in a cycle, the entire ecosystem flourishes. So again, if we're creating a predatory model that eats the existing vision of economic development, this is the type of radical reframing we have to do to see the human beings in Black Baltimore right now as the anchor institutions. But we need some help to make these anchor institutions flourish. So imagine this credit union, innovative services. What if they give you a debit card, a credit card, call it the Black Card, and this Black Card automatically gives you a discount when you patronize a Black business or institution within this network. So this Black Card is an example, again, of a competitive vision of economic development where you specifically want to shop at these great businesses in the Black Arts District. You want the new innovative things coming out of the Black boutiques. So if you have to choose where to bank, it gives us a natural incentive to bank at this credit union over some other banks. And you can think of the actual predatory banks that are trying to use propaganda to get Black folks to enter into their ecosystems.
Let's just say I had a business meeting and I wanted to impress somebody. I just wanted to go to Ida B's downstairs. It's expensive, right? So maybe I just didn't want to take $100 out of my savings account and put it in my checking account right now. It's like I saved up all this money. Why do I have to do that? Like, why can't I just get a little bit of credit, swipe it, support a Black business, and then my savings account, which I've been given to religiously because I want to win that savings lottery, will be my collateral.
And the algorithm of the computer that processes that payment charges you significantly less, because that is the Black premium. For your Black dollars going to a Black business.
Quicksilver gives you unlimited 1.5% cash back on every purchase every day and makes it easy for you to redeem your rewards. Unlimited and easy. What else do you need to know? You tell me. What's in your wallet?
You can get more out of banking here than that place like Capital One. You can reestablish the virtuous cycle that allows for these green shoots of development to grow and to flourish into the building blocks of a new ecosystem.
So I think this is a great example. I also think that Samuel L. Jackson in that commercial is just great because it's Samuel L. Jackson. I'm wondering, are there any other models or examples that you can give?
Yeah. So we have our foundation for our new ecosystem, but let's begin to populate our ecosystem with figures, with entities that might actually do work. So imagine a new entity that is the center for our Black community. And in looking for some models in our study group, there was one example that came up that I think is pretty interesting.
You always tell yourself you're going to go, but you never get there.
Oh, the gym.
Exactly. Actually, even just thinking about this money I paid in the gym, I think it's worth it.
Yeah.
But because in terms of the prevention of the real big health bills down the line, but I don't even know if we have a full-service Black gym in Baltimore. And if we did, just like all examples of Cooperative show, if you have a superior product that's catering to the community, just like the Harlem residential cooperative, people might even be willing to pay more money to get access to it. And my gym has massage therapy. So they're doing like preventative health care at the gym. They have a restaurant attached to it. So they're doing this nutrition stuff at the gym. Black people need that way more than white people do, but white folks are the folks that have it. They're even using something like a gym as a hub to kind of aggregate not just economic resources, but also different types of services to get to the prevention of the healthcare spectrum. And to build the type of, be a social container a social mixer to create the type of vernacular institutions necessary for this vision of Baltimore.
So imagine what comes with like people who are trained, physically fit, and part of their physical fitness regimen is to patrol the community so other people can do it. And that's how you provide both for public health and public safety.
I didn't even think about that. I was telling John the other day about the ability to build on top of the gym, because I hate going from the gym to my house. I'd love to have an apartment or a condo that I had shared equity in above my gym. That would be perfect. But that's not something people think about, at least when it comes to black folk and economic development. So you just start weaving these things together. You start to get a new world.
Integrate physical, unskilled labor. It's toned and trained. You need somebody to shovel your snow or to move something for you. You call the gym. The gym does that. It organizes people and it gets people in being part of this arrangement. Maybe it pays for their use of the equipment.
I've even seen some contraptions that use, I think it's called piezo electricity, or you somehow capture that energy that people
like when you're on the stationary bike and you need to run the TV.
So you're doing all of these things. But they then have an incentive to organize in order to do those things. And so it becomes a hub of organized people. And just imagine the gym being the place where political power is leveraged.
And it is. Like Martin O'Malley goes to my gym. Like it is that place. But it just hasn't been for us, for this type of political power. Like you going to the right gym can help you if you're trying to network your way.
So we're creating alternative realities that have real plausibility within our framework, our existing system. Just by thinking of various places, various nodes where if you changed a little bit, you change it a lot.
And I mean, if you get a good clientele, I imagine, these gyms are relatively profitable. Imagine if that's in a cooperative structure, where they aren't seeking to make profit. If they reinvested in all these ancillary institutions that we're talking about, if the profit's not being aggregated, Mr. Merritt. Mr. and Mrs. Merritt. Mr. and Mrs. Planet Fitness.
Gyms make a lot of money. Some people give money every month, don't really go, but it feels good just to know you're part of a community and you can work out if you need to. It's more than just fitness, it's a social container that generates profits, usually for people not from our communities. So imagine a new world where this gym is cooperatively owned and it serves as a hub for our new visions of our black future community. Again, a potentially competitive vision where if you're a black personal trainer or a black yoga instructor, you have to go from gym to gym to gym, from space to space, getting enough gigs for you to survive. What if we were able to concentrate through the promissory model, create more investment in these private contractors that do fitness and give them a hub where they have an ownership stake in this very gym so they don't have to hustle all over the place, but can build up this institution to be viable for themselves and their communities. I think it goes even further than that. What if you had the gym not just offer a massage here or there, but to be an actual valuable source of medical care, preventative medical care in black communities? The types of analysis, pre-screening, and chiropractor work that can make a real benefit for people's lives, but doesn't really require you to go to a full hospital. What if, like you brought up, Brion, you had black farmers giving their produce to the gym? And what if you, for example, had like a meal prep service, a service you could sign up for, where if you didn't want to cook dinner or didn't want to pay $20 for lunch every day at work, the gym can serve as a hub for fresh produce that's healthy, going to you every day, every week, giving you time and reinvesting your money back into the community. And if you think about it, we already have the land and the beginnings of the infrastructure for this seemingly radical model.
In Search of Black Power podcast is made possible by LBS Community Sustainers. We're in the tradition of people like Ella Baker in the cooperative movement of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, who used funding from the community as the basis for supporting independent black political work. Or in the tradition of people like Marcus Garvey of the United Negro Improvement Association that used resources from the community, from the organizing he did, as the basis for the power of that organization. Become a community sustainer by investing $15, $20, or $50 each month. Simply visit lbsbaltimore.com/sustain to sign up.
So I find this conversation interesting because on a project we were working on, I saw a paper from a national think tank basically recommending how Baltimore should use its rec centers. And they said that people in Baltimore wanted swimming and gymnastics because they interviewed like 20 people. And I thought this was exactly what the problem is with our current discourse. Is you have a Eurocentric institution coming in and reflecting a vision of the future of Baltimore being integration into whiteness. And then saying, look, it's what the people want. So instead of giving it over to the Aspen Institute or having companies buy our rec centers, we should own them ourselves and build them up to be real institutions embedded in our community that can be some of the institutions that populate our future black ecosystem.
So if these futures are what the community envisioned, how do you trust the visions of the future communities produce will work?
I think that's a really important question. Because at the end of the day, as much as we try on this podcast, we can't truly predict the future. So one thing in my studies, there's actually a great book called Envisioning Real Utopias by Eric Olin Wright that I've been reading. He talks about we need institutions not just envisioned for the future, but institutions that are nimble enough to be able to change as the future throws things to us that we can't predict. And here in Baltimore, we at LBS are helping to build what we hope is an example of one of these future institutions that can give community capacity to adapt to the things that we can't predict. So in Baltimore, there was a policy created that wanted to create basically a youth fund. And many people were concerned that the same old people, the Aspen Institute types, would take this money and invest in divisions of the past, the nonprofit industrial complex that doesn't work. So LBS and other people in the community said, no, we need to build this as an institution for the future. And the way we do that is we have this youth fund, which gives money out every year, have it be done through a community assembly, where people from community, with technical support, are able to actually build upon their existing social networks and have that be the mechanism that decides who gets funding. And not just have it be a cool cookout or some programming for the summer, but actually invest this youth fund money into capacity building for institutions that may do good work, but maybe don't have the scale to do full-scale services to the community. So what if we're helping people get their 501c3s? What if we're helping people with their bookkeeping and their fundraising so that this can be the actual institution that creates the new entities in our ecosystem in the future?
Well, tonight, politicians in Baltimore say they are trying to give kids the keys to the city.
A one-of-its-kind Children and Youth Fund promises to get young people off the streets and get them into doing something positive.
ABC 2 News' Brendan McNamara joins us right now with how it all works. Brendan.
Well, Jamie and Kelly, young people are so fired up about this plan that they marched through the streets for it tonight. They're letting the city know what kind of programs they want to see, and because of how this works, they just might get it.
We are here now to march, and let's march.
Led by the Frederick Douglass High School Marching Band, dozens of students and families traced the steps of the 2015 riots for 1 mile in West Baltimore, all in support of something different.
A lot of things seem to be reactionary. Things seem to be happening to them in their own communities, and it's about time we listen to them as well.
The recently approved Children and Youth Fund would grant up to $12 million to nonprofits serving the city's young people, like Richard Little and Dennis Morgan, who keep themselves busy in Frederick Douglass's media production program.
It means a lot because you're trying to change the youth in the streets, trying to get kids out the streets to do better stuff.
Because if we have nothing to do, we tend to just go
and hang around in the streets and do nothing. But if we have more clubs in school, we'll be in school till 6, 7, 8 o'clock in our clubs. Then our parents are forced to come pick us up.
At the high school Tuesday, City Council's Children and Youth Committee unanimously approved a plan that would allow community members and students to decide which programs would see that money.
It was youth that pushed the bill through. And what's powerful about the Youth Fund is that not only is it $12 million to go to youth programs, but young people will actually have a voice in how the funds are distributed.
And it shows we as a community respect our children. A lot of children don't feel respected at all.
It's an effort to help young people advocate for their own futures and find ideas that work in Baltimore. Some fear that $12 million isn't enough.
I think it definitely makes a big impact, but I don't want to underscore the fact that we're definitely going to need more. It's going to take more attention. It's going to take continued attention.
And where that fund money would be spent is being decided. It would be decided by what's being called an assembly of citizens. And initial meetings to figure out who would be on that assembly could begin as soon as February, as long as the plan is approved by the entire city council.
So we got a Black Arts District, Youth Fund, new credit unions, Uber gyms. All of these institutions building in our future for a black city. And I want to end this conversation addressing the one concept from our past and our present, which is so overwhelming. It makes people think that black cities may not even have a future. Something we've talked about, the question of violence and crime. So if we think about even the conversations we've had on this show, so much of the question of crime comes from this idea that there was this social contract, this agreement that we're supposed to have with society. And if you break it, you deserve to be ostracized from society. That, of course, is hard for black folks, given the social contract was never designed for us and was often designed on our backs. But if you imagine a future where all these black institutions exist, you have a chance for young folks to buy into a new social contract, a society that begins potentially to live up to a world where it's worth following the rules because you can see a chance to get ahead. And if that doesn't happen in the future, and people do break our new social contract in our black city, we fortunately have examples from our cultural past that we can build upon and bring into our black future. In Rwanda, there's a centuries-old concept of gacaca, or the justice in the grass, with the community, as opposed to jurors and judges in white robes with white wigs, create a system of justice for themselves. After the Rwandan genocide, there were so many perpetrators that there was no ability for the colonial justice system to accommodate this. So the gacaca system was brought back in a big way, to the point where over 12,000 gacaca courts were established nationwide to address the legacy of trauma and violence from the Rwandan genocide.
In December 1996, conventional courts and the national court system began trials, but after 2 years, only 1,292 genocide suspects had been tried. At this rate, it would have taken up to 200 years to complete all of the over 100,000 trials. So gacaca courts, a centuries-old Rwandan tradition, were reformed as a way to speed up the trials, reduce the prison population, quickly rebuild the nation's social fabric, and reunify the fractured country. Gacaca trials were where community members and elders met to solve property, inheritance, minor injury, and marital disputes. But serious matters, such as murder, were judged by the king, not the elders. So how could this informal process be used to execute justice for crimes worse than murder? Beginning in 2002 and spreading nationwide by 2005, the gacaca courts became the major source for compromise for genocide-related cases.
And there were 3 categories of crimes, some of which were dealt with by traditional authorities. But essentially for assault and below, it was dealt with by a community tribunal where there was a conversation had between community, and the community decided what the punishment was. And even the word punishment is reframed in this institution, because it is more a question of what the individual has to do to be reintegrated into society. That is the goal of gacaca. Classically, the number one example is the perpetrator has to rebuild the victim's house. And this is exactly the type of communal, symbiotic social justice that is completely off the map for our current visions of a criminal justice system. So in a future black Baltimore, where we must remember that 50% of the crimes that happen against black men go unreported. We're living in a society that doesn't feel like the Rwandan genocide, but there's a serious problem of violence, and reparations have to be made between black people and community. But sending folks to jail may not be the best way to do that. So imagine a future where these community tribunals offer the possibility of social redemption and reintegration as the center of our criminal justice system. All those institutions built by the Youth Fund, those new urban farms, those new youth programs, those new construction programs, what if the so-called punishment for people who violated our new social contract was to serve in those organizations? Add labor and add capacity to these existing institutions, and you keep people grounded in community. You give them access to the one asset they need to actually reintegrate into society, social connection, and a meaningful role in community. In our conversations about the future, we can sometimes get so seduced by the technology, the maglev trains, the flying cars, that we can lose the cultural technologies from our past. And one thing that John Henry Clark points out is, what can we learn from African societies which had no word for jail, because in their mind, they didn't need them. So it's in this spirit that when we think about our new black city, our black futures, we're building a vision that is genuinely competitive with the futures that have been sold to us, and we're told there is no alternative to them. So maybe the true predatory alternative, the true super predator of our new black ecosystem is the Sankofa bird, the African symbol that says, go back and fetch it. And in order to go forward, we must look into our past. And this could be the beginning of our new black cities, our Sankofa cities, where we hopefully can begin to live in the future. Thank you for listening to In Search of Black Power. Make sure to follow us, like, and subscribe on Twitter and Instagram at LBS Baltimore, and on Facebook at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You can find this podcast at www.thenewtimbuktu.com and on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you can find podcasts. You can also support us and become a sustaining member at www.lbsbaltimore.com.
In Search of Black Power was created by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, hosted by Lawrence Grandpre and myself, Lady Brion. Our associate producer is Iyori Odigizuwa, and our engineer is Justin Gladden. Our research assistant is Aaron Brown, logistical support from Nadira Smith, and a thanks to the whole #LBS gang. We'll see you next time in Search of Black Power.